Saul was head and shoulders above every other Israelite. 1 Samuel 9:2, it talks about that. So physically, he was primed to lead the charge against the Philistines and Goliath, but instead of stepping forward to protect his people, he hid in a tent. He paralyzed his nation with fear. And you know what they did is, he expected under-equipped soldiers to solve a problem that he refused to face himself. And so you look at that at the beginning of his ministry, he was a coward, and cowardice is epidemic.
Welcome back to the Immutable Word. Today we're talking about lessons on leadership, and in particular, just universal principles that can apply in whatever it is that you're doing in any industry or any role. It really doesn't matter. Also, when I think about leadership, you might think of somebody with a really important title, right? That's not always the case. Leadership is also behavioral. It's the things you do that influence people around you in terms of doing the right things instead of telling them what to do or using some sort of command or role power, as it's called. You remember, Robert, we did that manager tools episode a while back now. We were covering the effective manager stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, we were kind of covering, general business management, leadership, leading teams, things like that.
Yeah. And we touched upon some of the leadership aspects of being an effective manager. The effective manager was more of a tool set.
Well, we did kind of an overview of the book, and then we utilized the book kind of as a baseline, because we were recommending the book, but we were talking about some of the principles and things that are laid out in the book. And I guess today what we wanted to do, because it's more kind of a case study in the Bible, and just use two individuals and just kind of look at their two kings in the Bible, which is King David and King Saul, and kind of look at their characteristics, their attributes, how they influence their men or lack thereof, and just, talk about it in general from your perspective as a manager leader, as my perspective, leading teams, things like that, there's a lot of parallels, right? I mean, would you say, I guess let me ask you this, as a manager, what would you say are some of the most important aspects of management and leadership that you've learned over the past 20 years?
If I were to think of one thing, the first thing would be presence. Being present with your people, being with your team. You've got a lot of leaders that tend to be disconnected, and they're often isolated in their island, and they roll stuff down to you, but there isn't a connection there between you and the rest of the team that's executing on that particular mission. So presence is important. I know we're going to cover a lot of that when it comes to leading from the front, or being with a team, or being with them on the front lines. You don't ask somebody to do something that you wouldn't do yourself.
Right.
I would say that's one big thing. So presence and communication is probably the next biggest thing, is being able to communicate clearly, thoroughly, and there's no question about what it is that you're looking for your people to execute on.
So I mean, when you say presence, like, why would you say that that's important as opposed to what would be the opposite?
Well, if somebody isn't there, what kind of influence would they be able to project on anybody? If you don't have somebody there that's willing to do the work, or let's say in a military environment, put themselves in danger, leading from the front.
So kind of like setting an example, setting a precedent,
right?
As a leader. Okay,
exactly.
The reason why I ask is, I mean, I know but I'm just, for the sake of our audience, somebody might say, well, my boss shows up to work all the time. He's always in his office. Yeah, he's always there. So, I was just saying, maybe you can kind of like clarify, when you say present, what that means as far as leadership is concerned.
It's a gift. Present. Get it?
They're born with it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a gift. Yeah, I got you. Because the past.
Dad joke. But yeah, that I think it's good to define what presence means, because like, I see him in his office and we wave at each other. That's not what I mean. So presence is setting the precedent, doing the work, being able to also do things that might be perceived as dangerous, like I said, in the battlefield, when you're asking your team to do something that's very, very difficult, you are willing to do it yourself, and you do it with them. So
Right.
you're in the trenches with the team, and they see that, and that's the kind of presence that people need to
Right.
project that right influence. They're going to want to follow you. That it's going to build trust and build a strong relationship and loyalty.
Right.
And that's typically
Yeah.
what you see.
Yeah. And there's there was a saying I know that we used to have at work was be present, meaning that if you have a direct report talking to you or you're talking to your manager, you're not off in la la land, right? You're there and you're listening and you're interested in the conversation of your direct report. You're showing that you have a vested interest in their life, their career, so forth and so on. I would say, from my perspective, kind of related to that is I think one of the most important aspects of a manager leader, we use that term, I feel like interchangeably, which is fine because I think if a good manager should have good leadership. But
Yeah.
I would just say that, I think one of the most important key aspects, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit more, is that, you manage people, is learning how to grow people, how to build relationships with people, how to, get that discretionary effort from them where they want to serve you or they want to be a part of your team. They want to give that extra effort, right? There's a difference between being told what to do, the role, you have that role power, relationship power, right? Being told what to do because I'm your boss versus, man, I know that my manager really cares about me and I want to go the extra mile to try to meet his expectations, right? So to me, that's where the being present to me leads to that. And I think it's important. Anyway, I just, I wanted to, I thought it'd be good just for us kind of as it's a little bit departure from the Bible stuff, but it's, and to me, we talked about it before. Every good principle is a biblical principle, and that would include
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
Um,
I was just thinking about it too, as before we go into what we're about to talk about, is the influence. When you're being empathetic, you're listening to them. Communication is a big part of it. The other part of it's, you're touching upon it, is empowerment, where you trust people to do the job without you having to micromanage them and tell them
right,
every step of the way. So as Pat had said, George S. Patton, he was a World War II general. He said, never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity.
right. Yep.
And that allows people to, one, grow. They develop their own leadership skills by
So,
managing their own way to achieve.
maybe you can explain this because I already know I'm thinking of people listening to the podcast, right? And they're thinking, well, my manager's a micromanager. He constantly tells me what he expects of me. He's always telling me the rules. He's always laying out, processes that I'm supposed to follow. He's definitely a micromanager. Maybe you can help define what micromanager means.
Yeah, I've heard that too. So going through the same exercise of defining those terms, a micromanager is somebody that tells you what to do, tells you every step of how to accomplish that task or tasks, and then would just sometimes just do it themselves because you're not doing a good enough job. And so they're getting in the way of you or somebody that could have been trusted to do it. Now you steal that opportunity from that person to grow. But not only that, you also steal the trust that task or that trust that you're giving this person to accomplish this thing. You're stealing that away, and you're also creating more work. There's nothing productive about it. And so you're also supposed to multiply leaders in a team where you trust them with the task. You tell them where to go, and you let them figure out a way of how to achieve that.
Right.
And they grow. You build trust that way, and they're able to develop it. And also, in terms of the team or the organization or maybe a military unit, it benefits everybody in that group working that way.
Right. Right. So micro, just like the word, suggests, it's micro. Every tiny little bit of the task is managed by your manager versus letting, the direct report do the work. Like
Right.
allow them to do the work. allow them to figure out the hard parts, allow them to figure out the obstacles and how to come up with solutions. The micromanager won't let his team do that. It's not about not setting boundaries. It's not about not laying out rules and expectations, because here's the thing, I don't know how many, times I've worked for a manager and I've had no expectations given to me. And then what happens? Then all of a sudden, come review time, I find out I didn't meet any of his expectations, but he failed to communicate that to me,
Yeah.
right? So to me, it's not a bad thing when a manager lays down the rules, lays down the processes, lays down the expectations, but then allows me to do the workflow,
Yeah.
allows me to innovate, allows me to come up with ways to resolve the problem and come up with solutions, right?
And what that does for somebody who sets those expectations for you is that they take those accomplishments that you were able to achieve as a result of your ingenuity, your ability to be creative, to solve problems, and advocate for you,
Right,
and be able to give you even more opportunity to expand the role. And that's how you move up. That's how you grow. And
right.
a good leader does that. They do that for their people.
If you don't grow under your manager, meaning in a year's time, if you're not in a position where you can easily step into your manager's role and lead teams, then your manager's not doing their job.
Right. They're
You're
failing somewhere in one of those pillars, whether if it's
That's right.
communication, whether it's the way they manage, if they're a micromanager, or them not being present, things like that.
Right.
If you have no direction,
That's right.
if you don't know what you should be doing, or if you're not getting any kind of guidance in terms of course corrections in your career, you should expect that. No one's
That's
perfect. You ought
right.
to have somebody come in and say, "Hey, you just got to course correct a little bit. Just got to fix this little thing. You're well on your way. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah.
Move
How
stuff
do
out
you
of their
know?
way."
Like, it's just like a map, right? If I don't have a map in front of me and I'm just driving blindly, how do I know how close I am to my
Yeah.
destination? How do I know I'm taking the right turns? I'm going the right way, you know?
Would a good leader allow you to crash if they know what the
Yeah.
route looks like you're saying? So in a corporate environment, those that work in probably, not even corporate, but usually performance reviews are a pretty common thing these days. It usually happens maybe once a year. Sometimes it happens twice a year. And what a performance review is somebody, your manager, and you are sitting down. You're looking at your performance, just as it's described, and they look at the things you're doing. Are you doing what's expected in your role? Are there areas that you can improve in? Are there things that you've been doing great in? And then based off of that, you're usually incentivized or something like that, or you get promoted and so forth. You have to be specific. You got to give them the situation, you got to give them the behavior, and then what is the impact? So if it's like, hey, you got to do better. You're not giving me enough updates. And that's literally it, right? Or
Right.
you didn't do this thing last week, so no, you don't deserve advancement. Okay, what specific things do I need to improve? But most importantly, at what point during the entire year were you going to coach me, or at least course correct me, and not wait for a 15 or 20-minute conversation on the performance? So
Right.
I say all that to say this is that there's a communication problem there. There's communication failure on a part of a leader that is supposed to set those expectations specifically, but also communicate when it's time to provide some sort of constructive feedback on that journey.
So, and I'd sum it up like this: what you just said is, when you come to a performance review, and whether you're meeting, not meeting, or exceeding that performance review, should not be a surprise the day you're doing this performance review. If you have coaching problems, if you have performance issues at work, you should be well aware of what you've been coached on, what performance issues you've been missed, so forth and so on, long before you come to your annual performance review. It shouldn't be a surprise,
No,
period. So and I just want to be clear about this, because I do want to delineate, that is not a problem of the direct report. That's a problem of the leader. It was the leader's fault for not clarifying what those expectations are. It was the leader's fault for not consistently communicating or consistently giving feedback real time when those performance metrics were not met. It was the fault of the leader. That's why we're talking about this today is, leadership is critical. Like it doesn't listen. There may be people here that are listening. Maybe you're married. Guess what? There are key leadership principles that you need to be able to employ in your marriage. I'm not saying you run your marriage like a business, but as far as like clear communication, as far as, being on the same page with your spouse, as far as, building strong relationships, those are the same types of principles that a good leader is building with his team should be a leader at the home as well. It should be with his kids. It should be with, his neighbors. I mean, he should be setting that type of precedent. But here's the thing. You don't come to a marriage and 5 years down the road, you realize that marriage is falling apart because you guys never discussed anything. And you as the man of the house never was the man, right? And you were and there was a confusion about who the man was in this relationship because you never communicated and you never left those doors open. So the point is, this it doesn't matter if you're married, not married, you could be a worker out, you could be a janitor at work. And here's the point. One day you're not going to be a janitor. One day you might be the head janitor. One day you may be running the school, you may be running the facility. One day you may be a director, who knows, of a critical facility or a facility in general. But the point is if you aren't learning how to grow as a good leader, even if you're under a bad leader, if you're not learning how to grow as a good leader, then you are not going to meet the responsibility and expectation of a Christian. You just said it. If I'm a Christian, I ought to be able to do everything to the best of my ability to be the best worker, even if I have a bad boss. And there's actually some biblical examples of that. But the point is that, this topic of leadership, the reason why it's so important is because we have people that listen to us that are pastors. We have some that are missionaries. We have some that listen to us that, they work in the ministry in the church. Maybe it's a children's church. Maybe it's a nursing home ministry. Whatever the case is, if you don't exhibit good leadership skills, then you're not emulating the principles that are grounded and rooted in Scripture. The Manager Tools has a podcast called How to Manage, How to Coach Up.
Yeah.
How to coach your manager. And you got to be careful about that, right? You're not trying to tell him where he's wrong necessarily, but what you want to do is show, hey, I have an interest to grow here. What I need is for you to step in and provide coaching.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, you have an independent nature in and of yourself, Alan, that as a manager, you can figure this stuff out. But think about people that aren't as experienced, that don't know how to fill those gaps in their own performance, right? And that's what's frustrating. So, I mean, that's kind of like, the motivation behind this particular podcast is like, hey, if you're a leader in a ministry, and this, this is a Christian podcast. So if you're a leader in a ministry, you owe it to yourself to be the best manager leader you can. These things that we're talking about, the kind of manager that do not know how to communicate, that don't know how to set clear expectations, that don't know how to coach the gaps and build and build the career of their people. That's the kind of leader you don't need to be as a Christian. You need to learn how to overcome those things and be clear, concise, succinct, set the precedent, be there, have a presence among your team, and so forth and so on.
And it's easy to complain about these things, and people watch you. You have a testimony, especially if you're in any kind of authority position at any job. Doesn't matter what job you're doing. You have that testimony to uphold. So those values, those biblical principles, are all going to apply. So maybe leadership is really bad. Should you be talking about how bad they are to the people that you're managing? Probably not. No. The answer is
well.
no.
I could tell you from the ministry perspective, this doesn't include our current pastor, but I've been under, or I've seen, or I've experienced pastoral leadership that was horrible. I mean, just they were not emulating any of the Christian qualifications of pastoral, qualifications for elder or leader. And man, I'm telling you, I mean, the Bible talks about that. Some of those qualifications being apt to teach is supposed to be given to hospitality, for example. There are various. You know what Paul said to Timothy? He says, "You've known my manner of life." He says, "You've known me, Timothy. You know how I lead. You know how I communicate. You know what my convictions are. You know what my preferences are." You know what that means? That Paul invested heavily into the life of Timothy.
Yeah.
He spent time building Timothy up so that Timothy can take leadership of churches and, the people under him, wherever he was going to pastor, he knew exactly what was expected of him because Paul didn't leave those gaps unfilled.
Yeah, it took time and investment, mentorship.
Yep.
And correcting behaviors, providing constructive feedback, and that's part of developing, any good leader. Any good leader has to start somewhere.
Yep, that's right. And that's why, I wanted to use these two examples in scripture, which is David and Saul. I mean, it was a few years ago that it was kind of eye opener for me, I guess you could say. And I saw a distinction in between the two of them. Let's see. Before I get to that though, I was just pulling up an outline that I was at a leadership conference or a church. It was a missions conference actually. And there was a pastor. He's an Australian missionary actually, and he talked about, or he gave an outline of teaching on what he called the manner of life discipleship, which is 2 Timothy 3:10 through 11 was his outline. And this is where Paul says to Timothy, he says, thou hast fully known my doctrine. So he knew what his doctrine was, his manner of life, purpose, faith, long suffering, charity, patience, persecution, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch, at Iconium, at Lystra, what persecutions I endured, but out of them all the Lord delivered me. And he said, to know the intimate details above about someone that Timothy knew about Paul, to know those intimate details about Paul indicates that there was a close relationship, which tells you that Paul, as he led and built up Timothy, he built a very strong, this discipleship with him. It was a very strong relationship. And then he kind of started showing Jesus Christ, where this model is seen in Jesus' own ministry in the lives of the 12 apostles, right? He interacted with Peter, James, John on a regular basis. Jesus, even though he loved the world as far as dying for them, he died for the world, but he did not disciple the world, which means he had to build those men up to take over when he left. That's called delegation. That means if you think about it, those 12 apostles were representative of Jesus Christ after he left. Well, guess what a manager has to do? A manager has to work himself out of a job.
Sounds strange, right? But that's the truth, is that what you're doing is that, I hate this buzzword, but you're trying to build a force multiplier in your team or in your unit or whatever it is that you're multiplying leaders. So that way they can lead, and then they can train others, so forth and so on. And that's the way it ought to be. If you have somebody that's very protective of knowledge, of information, they're not sharing anything, they're not willing to mentor anybody, well, that's not indicative of a good leader. That's not the behavior of a good leader. Sorry, that you're just a lone wolf.
Right.
That's more
so
destructive
with that being said, I mean, it's pretty clear that you can have good leaders and bad leaders, right? I mean, it's pretty clear. The question is, these principles, these qualities, these attributes of a leader, how does looking at the lives of Saul and David give us some indication or some insight into how we should behave or become a good leader, right? Because both of them were kings. Both of them, Saul was the first king of Israel. And what I was going to say is, I was reading my Bible one time years ago, and I noticed, at the beginning of Saul's ministry, they faced Goliath, the Philistines, right? Now, the Bible described, Saul was head and shoulders above every other Israelite. 1 Samuel 9:2, it talks about that. So physically, he was primed to lead the charge against the Philistines and Goliath, but instead of stepping forward to protect his people, he hid in a tent. He paralyzed his nation with fear. And you know what they did is, he expected under-equipped soldiers to solve a problem that he refused to face himself. And so you look at that at the beginning of his ministry, he was a coward. And cowardice is epidemic, I think it was Patton that might have said that.
Yeah, I mean, those are strong descriptions of a person, but that's true. At the end of the day, that's the legacy this person's leaving behind, but also the impact of individuals that are under this person who they're supposed to lead
Right,
and are supposed to grow. And you know what? There's a saying that people leave their bosses, they don't leave the companies.
right. They
There's a
leave their
lot,
bosses.
yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. I'd say probably the majority of people that leave dissatisfied is because of the person they work for directly,
Right,
because they had some sort of involvement with blocking their advancement, their growth, their working environment. There's no trust. I mean, it's a huge mess.
yeah.
And it's epidemic these days. It's hard to find people that exhibit good leadership in general.
Well, what you're describing is exactly what I saw in Saul. When you look at Saul, he had a problem with anger. He had a problem with jealousy. He
Right.
had a problem with pride. He had a problem with communication. He had a problem with honesty, transparency. I
Yeah.
mean, on and on and
Sound
on.
familiar?
These are
Yeah.
these are the same things that you see in Saul, and it's indicative again at the beginning of his ministry, where those that he was leading were scared to fight one giant, right? One giant. But and that's the beginning of his ministry. But when you look at the end of David's ministry as king of Israel, over there in 2 Samuel 23, you know what happens? You see these mighty men of valor who refuse to let David go out to battle. They said they don't want to extinguish the light of Israel. And you know what those mighty men of valor do? They kill 6 giants of their own without David. Without David. So you see Saul's leadership, they're scared of one giant where he should have led the charge. He should have stood in, direct leadership. He should have influenced his people to go out there and fight, and they were hiding in a tent, and it took a little teen boy with a sling, right, to go kill the giant in order. And then of course at the end of David's ministry, you see the exact opposite. So I asked myself, I was like, man, what was different in their leadership styles? What was different in the characteristics and the attributes of their leadership? And, you see one where there was cowardice, and then you have one that was courage in the face of, insurmountable odds. 6 giants were killed by these men, and they would not let David. Anyway, I just think about that stuff. They loved him so deeply, and they had, and it kind of brings me back to 1 Samuel 22 when Saul was chasing David and wanted to kill him. There was a group of about 400 men that rallied around David, and you know what the description was of those men? It says in verse 2, 1 Samuel 22:2, it says, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves unto him, unto David, and he became captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So the distressed, those that were indebted, and those that were discontented, they were drawn to David. Why? Because David invested himself in his people. He loved his people. Matter of fact, there was a point in time where he had numbered Israel when he wasn't supposed to number Israel. And the Bible says that there was a plague that was cast upon them, and thousands in Israel died. And David was heartbroken over that. So, and there was times whenever David, even with the sin of Bathsheba and Uriah, he had committed a great, horrible sin. And you think about it, that was completely unlike David. And I believe that's why when he was confronted by Nathan, he was so sensitive about his sin that he realized he had sinned against God, according to Psalm 51. But you know what? Here's the interesting thing is that when you look at David, as far as like the comparison between the two of them, David owned up to his sin. When Saul sinned, because here's the challenge. This is something that blew my mind when I thought about it. Okay, think about this. What was David's great sin? it was murder and adultery, right? Well, according to Leviticus, there was no sacrifice for murder and adultery. As far as the law is concerned, David should have been put to death. Okay? Okay, what was Saul's sin? Saul refused to kill a bunch of sheep.
He didn't fully obey God's command.
Now, think about that. In your estimation and my estimation as human beings, which one is the greater sin? Not killing a bunch of sheep or murdering one of your greatest men of your mighty men of valor and then sleeping with his wife? Which would you say, in the estimation of humankind, is the worst sin?
Murder.
Yeah. And yet, God had mercy on David than he did Saul. And you know, the biggest difference is when Saul was confronted by Samuel, Saul gave excuses. He goes, well, the people wanted the best of the sheep. And then he lied about obeying God's command. And he says, I did obey God's command. And then Samuel had to say, well, what's this bleating of the sheep in my ears? I could hear the sheep. You're lying, Saul. And so lying was, again, and of course, rebellion was as the sin of witchcraft. And that's what Samuel told him. But David, when he was confronted by Nathan, immediately fell on his face and owned it. He says, I have sinned against thee and thee only, to God. So you know what the leadership principle there is, that when a leader messes up, guess what he does?
Take ownership.
That's right. He takes ownership of it. David took ownership of his mistakes. Saul didn't.
Yep. And there's a book by Jocko Willink. You've read it probably a couple of times, called Extreme Ownership. And he's talking about a hot wash. So, you know, we talk about hot wash. Hot wash is that after a battle, they quickly come together and talk about the things that went well, the things that didn't go well, what mistakes maybe some of the team members had made and things like that. And there was an operation that Jocko, I believe, was running, and he had his team there, and there were some things that went wrong, some big mistakes. And so he started going around the table and asking every one of them, hey, what went wrong? What happened here? Why did this not succeed? Or just something to that effect. And each one of the commanders or the people that were there in that hot wash is like, well, I didn't do this. I didn't follow protocol specifically here. It is my fault. And he's like, no, wrong. And he asked the other person, what happened? What went wrong? And he did this over and over and over again. And these people were like, well, I messed up. I didn't do this correctly. And went back to Jocko. He's like, no, you're wrong. The mistake is with me. I failed you guys by not giving you the proper communication or expectation or the proper procedures or the intelligence. That is on me, and I'm going to fix that. And going forward, you're going to have everything you need to be successful in the future. You know, you don't hear that, but that's, again, I was just thinking about that when you're
that's
about
ownership.
David.
That's ownership,
but,
exactly.
yeah.
And he tells other stories where there was commanders that if they took ownership, it could be career ending.
Yeah,
and they were willing to do that.
That's the price. Yep. And
so
they're not trying to protect their own careers and move up,
right.
But
self-preservation.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to do. Was I kind of wrote down 7, key characteristics of leadership, using, David and Saul as the example, and, just kind of go through the list and let's talk through the 7, just through each of one of them. It could be insight that we've had, but I wanted to highlight. So the 7 that I want to go through, the first one was lead from the front versus lead from the rear. Saul led from the rear, right? He was hiding while others had to take the risk of saving his nation, namely David. David spent his formative years fighting on the front lines. It earned him the moral authority to lead a nation. And of course, a true leader never asks someone to carry a burden that they are unwilling to touch with their own fingers. So talk about that, Alan, from your perspective, leading from the front versus leading from the rear.
Yeah, so leading from the front instead of leading from the rear. Have you ever had somebody tell you, hey, Robert, I need you to do this thing. You take care of it, when he could have showed you how to do it or go and do this task with you, and this person's never done it before? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Does that command respect and trust immediately?
Yeah, well, they're making you the guy that's going to take the fall if everything falls apart.
Everything fails, so they can point at you And again, that's self-preservation. Instead, hey, let's go ahead and let's do this together. And if it fails, guess what? Who's going to take the blame? It's going to be that
That's
leader.
right.
Even
if
though they're doing it together.
it's one thing to delegate, right? So that because you want your person to grow and you're willing to coach the gaps. Okay. It's another thing to get your people to do something you just won't lift your finger to do.
Right.
You're too lazy to do, and you wouldn't do it yourself. There's a difference between that. That's why a good leader is not going to give work to his people that he can't do himself.
Right. Yeah.
But what his interest is not to not do it, but his interest is to delegate a task so that his direct reports can grow.
And that's part of that presence. That's what we had defined. And so it's that kind of leadership presence that makes that impact, and you get that loyalty. You get people that want to do those things for you, just like you see with David and his mighty men.
I was going to say, an interesting relationship in the Old Testament, and it's often misconstrued, is David's relationship with Jonathan, which was Saul's son. The Bible says that the love that they had between them surpassed the love of women. So, this perverted cultural generation thinks, oh, they were homosexuals. But what they fail to understand is the love that in the military, the love for the guy fighting next to you is a different type of love than a man has for a woman. It's a love, the Bible says, Jesus Christ says, no greater love than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends, right? That love is unsurpassed. Matter of fact, let me see if I could find it. There was a note about as far as love. Let's see, love. There is a book that I read, and it talked about this, because again, when you say no greater love than a man lay down his life for his friends, there's something where, these people, what happens is that there's this love that a soldier will have for the guy fighting next to him. And here's a soliloquy that was written in a book. It's a fictional book that I read last year, but this is what it says. It says, what researchers and army psychologists had slowly come to understand, but what any grunt in a foxhole with his squad works out in 5 minutes, is that courage in war is simply love, nothing more and nothing less. Soldiers do not fight for causes. They don't, or for countries, or for flags, or for hatred. They fight for each other. They fight for the man to their left and the man to their right. And they do it because they love them. Courage was simply love made visible. And that right there is the love that's described between Jonathan and David. And you know why? Exactly what we just outlined here is that Saul he didn't set the example, but David spent most of his early years on the front lines fighting and getting his sword wet with the blood of his enemies. And Jonathan respected that because you know why? Jonathan was a soldier too. And there's something about men who have courage that befriend other men that have courage. Guess what? Now, I know that's an extreme example, but you know what? There's something to be said for a manager who will get down in the muck and the mire with you and will fight next to you and will work the hard battles. And when everything falls apart, he takes the brunt of the punishment. There's something to be said about a leader that'll do that.
Yeah, absolutely. When you got somebody that says that to the team or to the military unit or to the group, that all the successes belong to them, but all the failures belong to the leader. I mean, pay attention. That's a good leader. That's a very, very good attribute when somebody believes in that and actually acts upon that. And the reason why I call that out is that it's rare. It's hard to find people like that today because people aren't trained to be that way. Those principles are not followed. And then, a lot of this come from the Bible. Here's talking about David and Samuel and David's behavior. It's hard to find. I mean, it really is. So if you find somebody like that, attach yourself to that person, learn from that person, and likelihood is that they're going to mentor you into a leader as well.
Yeah, your manager, leader, whoever it is, they're willing to, maybe they don't know how to turn the wrench like you do, but they're willing to work
Yeah.
They're behinds off to do everything they can to support you, to provide the resources, the tools, the training, everything you can do, because the manager's real job is to remove the obstacles so you can do your
Yeah.
job.
The way I like to think about it is that they're the top cover. They protect you
Yeah.
from those people up top that are
Right.
rolling all this stuff down. They're the ones taking the heat, protecting you, and a good leader will do that.
Right.
And they're also the ones that provide, like you said, the support they need, moving things out of the way so that way they can get their work done. There was a survey that was done. I saw it on LinkedIn, so I don't know. It resonated with me, but there was this survey that was asking people, was like, what do you think keeps people motivated? That was the question. And it was not just giving people recognition, although that's important. It wasn't, giving them incentives. It was supporting their ability to get their work done.
Yep. That's it.
Something to that effect. I was like, that's true.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's some people that I was just talking to my manager today about. He went to do a skip level, which, a skip level is where, you go see, if you have a direct report that's a manager and then he manages directs, you bypass that middle manager and you go directly to the right. That's a skip level, right? So he did a skip level with one of my techs today. And one of the things that, he mentioned was that, that particular technician, normally he would have kind of a sour puss attitude. You know what I mean? He was, kind of bitter about things and upset because things didn't work out. Well, I've been coaching him over the past 6 months about, looking at solutions, trying to come up with solutions rather than always focusing on the problems, right? And what I've done for that particular technician is I've been able to raise issues that he's been dealing with at the ground level all the way up to our senior director level and even to our VP level, meaning that there's now movement where we're able to resolve and create more robust processes that didn't exist to support him. Now, I don't know the job technically like the technician does, right? So I told him, I said, you describe to me the problem, you give me the background, and I'll escalate it. I will support you 100%. I'll do everything I can to get the tools in place. I'll help put processes in places. I'll try to help hold people accountable. And that in and of itself is an example of leading from the front, meaning that, hey, you are not in this by yourself. I'm going to do everything I can to support you. And that's exactly what David did. David was a soldier at heart, and those men knew he was a soldier, and that's why they highly respected him.
Yeah. I mean, that's what people want. Just going back to the love comments with Jonathan and David, and I thought that was a really good quote. There's another quote, George S. Patton, our favorite general from World War II. He said, Americans love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle.
Right.
I had to throw that in there.
Well, I mean, but here's the thing, though. A man that loves the sting of battle, the man that loves victory, the man that loves combat is going to love another man that loves the sting of victory, that loves combat. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it is. And you know what? Most direct reports, they're going to fear and loathe one primary thing when they have a new manager. Is this guy just a pencil pusher? Is he the guy that just sits in his office and shuts the door and watches YouTube and TikTok videos all day long and tells me what to do? Or is this guy real? Is he going to listen to my actual problems? Is he going to actually does he have a vested interest in actually helping me do my job? You know what I mean? Because a good, honest man just wants to do his job. That's it. And if you don't give him the tools and the ability to do that, well, guess what? So that's an example of leading from the front. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to be an expertise in everything your direct report does. It just means you need to be present, like you said earlier, but you also have to be willing to get in the muck and the mire to help them remove those obstacles so they can do their job.
I'd say one thing about being present is just being informed, because you make a point that they don't need to be an expert in everything that their team is doing. That's why they have a team, where they have soldiers, they have the specialty, but they just need to be informed. So that way they know what they need to do and know how to fill the gaps if there are any to support the broader group of people or broader team, broader military group, whatever it might be.
Right. That's right. So lead from the front versus lead from the rear. Number 2, influence versus manipulation, which is pushing or pulling. You influence a person, you don't need to push them, you don't need to pull them. Saul he forced compliance through fear, insecurity, and reactive commands. Matter of fact, when they were first fighting the Philistines, he told them that they weren't supposed to eat anything the entire time they were battle until they defeated the Philistines. Jonathan and his armor bearer ended up eating some honey. And the Bible says that his eyes were opened up and he realized, because it was invigorating and it helped him during the battle to have the energy that he needed to defeat. I mean, he defeated a whole garrison of Philistines, and he was going to put Jonathan and the armor bearer to death because they disobeyed his strict compliance. So he ruled by fear and insecurity, and he was reactive. And so he didn't show any kind of, emotional intelligence or balance or leadership. Whereas David, he exerted this gravitational influence, right, through his heart that was aligned with God, and people knew it. He had a deep loyalty. What he did, again, we saw earlier, were those that were discontented, those that were distressed, and those that were in debt joined themselves unto David. Why? Because they knew David cared about them. Saul didn't care. Saul only cared about himself. He wanted to kill David over jealousy and pride. David offered no real threat to Saul. And if Saul had been sensitive to God's will, he would have done just like Jonathan did. He said, Jonathan told David, I already know God's going to put you and make you his king of Israel. He goes, I just want you to make a promise to me. And he said to preserve his house. And that's what ended up happening with Mephibosheth, his son that was, wounded as a child. But the point is that David was the exact opposite of Saul. He didn't manipulate people. He didn't force people to do his will. What he did is he influenced them, and they had a desire to follow David. There's a difference. So a good manager influences people. He doesn't manipulate them.
Exactly. That's the difference between the role power and the influence. And you always want to pull the influence lever 99% of the time.
Right.
If you can.
So the relationship power versus role power,
relationship power, yeah. That's
it. I'm your manager. You will do it because I am your manager.
I have this title. I had a guy that I was working with, and it was some sort of process thing. Like, how do we get these people to adopt this process? We're having a difficult time. He's like, well, you want me to go talk to him? I'll throw my director title around. I was like, no, it's okay. I'll go talk with them and explain to them why this is going to be beneficial to them and how it's going to help them do their job, and they'll probably adopt it because of that, regardless of what title you have, sir. So, yeah, I mean, it's just stuff like that. It's ridiculous.
And that's the key. And this is what I would say to an individual Christian is think about, if you're leading a group of people, do they want to work because they want to meet your expectations? Or do they want to work just because they're afraid of you? They're scared of being reprimanded or repudiated, right? It's like if your leadership causes fear instead of trust, then there's a problem with your leadership.
Yep.
So Saul was that way. I mean, when you follow Saul's life, I mean, that guy was manipulative. He couldn't control his own emotions. He lied. Again, it's just over and over again. He's the horrible manager. Where David was the guy that loved his people, that cared about his people, right? And that's what, to me, because David's human, just like anybody else, but when you consider the sin with Uriah, and God held him accountable to that to the rest of his life. Matter of fact, in the New Testament, when David, the lineage of Jesus Christ is being described in Matthew chapter 1, it says Bathsheba, he was married to Bathsheba, who had been the wife of Uriah, is what the Bible says. So that stuck with David the rest of his life, and then now it's preserved in Scripture for eternity at the end of the day. But this is what I was going to say is, because we know the character of David, because we know the love, the investment that he made in people, that's what made that sin so egregious and so horrible, is that he was much better than that as a king. And he neglected his duties, and he let his flesh and his lust get the best of him. And we see the outcome of that. The Bible says that lust, when it is finished, bringeth forth death in the book of James. And that's exactly what happened in the case. So influence your people want to please you. They want to, meet your expectations. They want to do their hardest and give that discretionary effort. A good leader doesn't need to push or pull his people, just needs to influence them.
Yep, right.
So number 3, leading people, not rocks. Leading people, not rocks. So Saul, obviously, he treated his army as like the chess pieces on a chessboard, and he did it to save his own throne. As far as he was concerned, he only pleased the people to save his own neck. Remember when he was caught by Samuel, and Samuel said, you didn't kill Agag, you didn't kill the best of the sheep. And you know what? Saul begged Samuel to show mercy on him in front of the people. He was more concerned about his image. So he wanted to save his own throne. Whereas David, he treated his people, again, the discontented, the distressed, those that are in debt. He celebrated their individual victories. He mourned their losses. Even his enemy, like one of his, I can't remember the name, it slipped my mind, but it was the general of Saul after Saul's death. There was supposed to be an agreement with them, and Joab ended up murdering him. And David said, a good man died. You saw David's heart for the people that he served under, even people that were at one point devoted enemies to him, but he mourned their losses. He recognized, and again, this is where a good manager, a healthy manager, will recognize his own people. He'll recognize the strength of his people. He'll recognize their contributions, and he'll recognize even their personal life. Like if you lead people and you don't know when their birthday is, or you don't know who their kids are, or you don't know that, their son is about to go into college, or their daughter is about to go in the military, or whatever. If you don't know about that, then you're not a good manager. Then you're just leading people just to move chess pieces on a board for your own career. It's sad, but we don't manage rocks, we manage people.
Yeah, there's something to that when it's part of the communication of a good leader is when they're sitting down, one, they're empathetic. They're empathetic to your challenges or the issues that you might be having, and then they'll provide ways to help you professionally or otherwise. But there's something to say about somebody that's asking you like, "Hey, Robert, how's your son doing?" And he told me that he was
Yeah.
having a tough time or he got in a car accident. Is he doing okay? And he remembers his name. And so when there's that personal connection, that just strengthens that bond or that relationship, and
Speaks volumes
it's
to that
very
direct
important.
report.
And I believe everybody knows who Napoleon is. Napoleon was, back in the 1700s, French Revolution and all that. But he used to talk to his soldiers and ask them about their families. And, Napoleon, everybody might have their opinions about Napoleon, but he generally was a really good leader. He understood those concepts, and that's why he had so many people that were willing to follow him into battle and often into destruction. So it's just,
There's that famous story of the guy, the soldier that Patton slapped, because he was crying, or I can't remember what the situation was. The guy was, basically acting like a baby, and he slapped him. But afterwards, nobody, you don't always hear the after story, but he had actually spent time getting to know that young man and kind of getting him encouraged again. And because, again, Patton knew that the people that were fighting for him were human beings. And, he was a rough leader, but he was a compassionate leader. And there's a difference, right? You can be strict, you can be by the book, you can be very process oriented, but you can also care about your people. And that's what matters. I think that's probably one of the hardest. There's 2 things I would say are the hardest obstacles to overcome as a manager. Number 1 is building strong relationships with your people. Number 2, because that means you have to care, right? And number 2 is giving your people the critical feedback they need whenever they mess up.
Yep.
I think those are the 2 probably most difficult things for a manager to overcome in their leadership, career.
Yep,
But
agreed.
we lead people, not rocks. All right. So we talked a little bit about this, but empowerment and setting the precedent. Okay. So Saul's leadership created a bottleneck of fear. Obviously, nobody wanted to go out there and fight Goliath. Everybody was scared to death. But in David's leadership, he created an ecosystem of courage, right? These mighty men of valor are renowned in the Bible, and you hear about them. And some of the things they did were just, I mean, supernatural. It's some amazing things. You had a man, one of his mighty men of valor. I think it might have been it wasn't Uriah was one of his mighty men, but there was another one that I can't remember his name now, but he fought a lion-like man in Moab. I don't even know in a snowy pit. I mean, I don't even know what that would be like, right? But some of these men, and some of them, would kill hundreds of enemies in a battle single-handedly. So anyway, he treated his men. He had this leadership that he set this example. And so he created this ecosystem, this culture of courage. And so when you set the right example, you breed a culture where your subordinates and your direct reports grow into leaders capable of protecting the mission when you're the one that can't, when you're weak, when you mess up or you're not able to do it, right? There's time, and I say that as far as weak in a battle sense, but you know what? You know what you ought to be able to do as a good manager? You ought to be able to go take a 3-week vacation and know that your entire team and their processes and their workflow won't miss a beat. And you can put a proxy in place to lead in your place.
That's when you know that you're leading your team right, because again, what are you doing? You're building other leaders that are autonomous, that make their own decisions, that
That's right.
can influence others because again, they're leaders themselves. So if you can walk away and nothing falls apart, because a lot of people have it the other way around. It's like, they need me. They need my leadership.
Right.
Otherwise, this team will fall apart. It's like, well, no,
Exactly.
that's a huge failure.
Exactly.
If it cannot run without you there, you are failing at doing something as a leader. You
That's
want
right.
to be able to walk
Exactly.
away.
If you can't tell your guys, say, hey, I'm going to be gone for a week. I need you to sit in on my leadership meetings. I need you to run my leadership reports. I need you to communicate to the president or the CEO or the senior, manager or whatever. And you are afraid to do that. And you can't take vacation because nobody can stand in your place and be your proxy while you're gone. You are failing as a manager, as a leader.
Yep. And that's just the hard truth. It might be something you haven't heard before, and you think that you have to be there. You've got to change that mindset.
That's right. And David's men, they could step into the battlefield as if David wasn't there.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And some of those men could do things that David never could. And so it's amazing to see. Again, to me, it's a brilliant case study.
Well,
when you look at these two kings.
And somebody who's leading anybody, whether if it's military or in a group or anything like that, is being able to identify the the weakness and strengths of the people and know how to deploy them.
Right.
There's
That's right.
so many people that have so many strengths beyond mine personally in my team that I leverage. I have people that are much better at articulating technical details of some sort of technology that I couldn't get even close to doing. So they do it, and I promote them to do that. There are other people that are better advocates, a better voice than I am. So guess what? I position them to be the voice and representative of that team. And everybody's very dynamic. There isn't no one person that does the one same thing or has the same strengths.
Another successful indicator that you're a good manager, a good leader, is that your people get recognized at least twice as much than you do.
Oh yeah, they get the spotlight. Hey, when you step into any kind of leader role, guess what? You are stepping back and you're pushing your team forward. They're the ones that are getting the limelight 100% of the time. If you're the glory hound and you're the one that wants to get on that pedestal because you're the quote unquote leader with the title, you're not gonna win over the respect and earn the trust of those people that are doing the work in the first place. It's
what I do is on a weekly basis, I put out a recognition report, what my team's recognition is that week. That includes recognition they've sent or received, right? And what I always try to do is I always try to make sure that the recognition that I've sent always outnumbers the recognition my team does, because I want them, and sometimes I won't get any recognition for weeks or months, but my team will get tons of recognition. And that's on purpose because I'm trying to empower them. I'm trying to set the precedent. Like when you do right, you get rewarded for it, right? You reward good behavior. And that's what I want to that's the precedent I want to set. I'm not there to try to empower me. I'm there to empower them. And so that's the example that a manager needs to set,
Yep. Right on.
So number 5 is communication and accountability. Saul obviously made excuses. He blamed the people in front of Samuel, and he rationalized his disobedience to God's word. Where David's failure, his failure specifically, obviously Bathsheba and Uriah, he owned up to it, and he communicated it transparently, and he said, "I've sinned against thee and thee only." And, effective communication, this is where it comes down to, it prevents confusion. You were talking about this earlier. It establishes clear boundaries, and it gives your teams the freedom to innovate within a safe structure, this structure where they can operate and they know exactly what they can or can't do.
All right, it's my turn to ask you the question, defining effective communication.
Yeah, effective communication, and to me, it's a simple definition. Communication, a good effective communication is what the other person hears. Why that's important is because it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. When you talk to somebody, you need to ensure that people understand what you're communicating. If you assume they understand, you're a bad leader. I say that all the time. I have a friend of mine, that, he's new to pastorship, and I remember early on in some of his ministry stuff, he would get frustrated because some of the, the leadership or the elders in his church would not behave a certain way or do things a certain way. And I'd always ask him, I said, "Well, do they know what your expectation is?" And he says, and just like your boss, "Well, they should already know." How should they already know if you never communicated it to them? And that's what I told him over and over again. Communication is what the other person hears. That means you're doing everything in your power to make sure the message that you're relaying is understood by your audience. Not, "Well, they should already know what I'm talking about." No. You need to ensure they know what you're talking about. You need to make sure that you're using language that they understand. That they understand the takeaway, what's the main theme and message you're relaying. If they don't understand that, you're not communicating effectively, period. So if you got direct reports, people that you're training, and you say, "Hey, I need you to take care of this," and you're vague about it, you're not specific, you don't give deadlines, you don't tell them who needs to do what by when, you're not outlining the clear roles and responsibilities of the people on this particular project, and you're not outlining those tasks and those deadlines, then guess what? It's your fault if that project falls apart.
Yeah. And this is also related to that if it's not written down, it's not a process.
Right. It's an opinion.
It's an opinion. But
if somebody can't point to a black and white document that outlines the process, then it's just your opinion. That's all it is.
I got stories behind that too, but we don't have enough time. But yeah.
All right. So accountability and communication. But go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
Oh, no. So anyway, I was just going to say accountability, again, is that ownership, like you were talking about, Jocko Willink's book. Extreme ownership, highly recommend it. I mean, if you are a pastor, if you're a leader, if you're a husband, right? If you own your own business, if you're trying to run your own business, or if you are trying to lead a team, you need to pick up Extreme Ownership. It's a great book.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
Yep. So accountability, communication. Communication, just it needs to be clear. And then, of course, self-preservation versus legacy. So Saul was just out to protect his throne, whereas David invested in his men. He was, I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at the end of David's life, when you start looking at that list of mighty men of valor, it is like a legacy of David's leadership. Even these men were phenomenal in their ability to fight, to lead, their courage, their honor, the things that they did all reflected the leadership of David. You didn't get that at the end of Saul's life. He ends up having another soldier kill him. So he dies by, suicide out of cowardice because he didn't want to be killed by the enemy. That's not David. David, I mean, at the end of his life, you know what he ends up doing? These men that go out, and he was thirsty, and he had wanted. It's in First Chronicles. I think it's chapter 11 where he said he wanted a drink of water from the well. I think it was at Bethlehem. I can't remember what it was. I hate that I didn't think about that. But anyway, he wanted a drink of water, and the Bible says that the men hazarded their lives to get the water from that well, and they brought it back to him. And you know what David did? He poured it out because he says, I'm not worthy to drink the blood of these men. Because those men would hazard it, and that's what it says, they hazarded their lives. They risked their necks for their leader. And that's the legacy that David set. It wasn't self-preservation. David would have gladly died for his men, but his men didn't want him to die for them. They wanted to lay down their lives for him. That's leadership. Nobody wanted to do that for Saul because, again, everybody knew he was just invested in himself. That's all he cared about was himself. So self-preservation and legacy, what does that say about managers today and leaders?
Again, they're a very special breed of people today that it's hard to find. So, like I said, if you could find those attributes in somebody, stick with them, learn from them. They are rare. And unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with a lot of people that lead that way. I'll leave you with this, though. Like, I don't know how many we have here. We did, what, 6? Yeah, 6. Or 7. We did 7? No, we did 6. Okay, sorry.
6.
Maybe I'll just save it for the end. I was going to say, I totally forgot what I was going to say, so please proceed.
That's okay. Well, let me go through the 6, and then we'll do the 7th real quick. So number 1 was lead from the front versus leading from the rear. Number 2, influence versus manipulation. Number 3, leading people, not rocks. Number 4, empowerment and setting the precedent. Number 5, accountability and communication. And then number 6 was self-preservation versus legacy. And number 7 is isolation versus protection. This is kind of the fruit of it. When Saul died, he died alone on Mount Gilboa. And he was basically ran through with the Spirit because he told him to, but he was by himself. Nobody was there to shield him. Whereas at the end of David's life, all of his mighty men of valor shielded him and protected him. The result of a good leader is that his people will be affected and impacted if something happens to their manager. In an emotional way. I'm not talking about they would fall apart as far as process-wise, but that the loss of that manager is going to be a severe impact to that team because that team knows that their manager is leading that team. He's not forcing them. Whereas a manager who's in it for himself, guess what? When he goes down, nobody's going to care.
Yep, that's it. So, I remember what I was about to say. Leadership is, people might think that leadership is a title. Sometimes you can have a title but not be a leader. Leadership has behavioral attributes to it. You got to remember that. So if you're under people that don't have those principles in leadership, and you had mentioned it earlier about having to sometimes manage up, but you also have your colleagues around you, you can be leaders to them. Your behavior as a leader, you can be a leader without the title.
Yep.
There's a bunch of titles. There's a bunch of titles that float around there. It doesn't mean anything at all. They're bad leaders. They're not leaders at all. But you can be a leader and be able to influence the people around you. And there's this book, another book. It's one of my favorite World War II era leadership books, which is Band of Brothers. And you talk about somebody there that was under a leader that was very oppressive, micromanaged, had some of the attributes like Saul would have, and you could see how Lieutenant Winters at the time was able to lead his people even under that type of oppressive leadership. And he gained the loyalty and the respect. They literally followed him into battle and trusted him.
Yeah, he earned their trust, even though at the time their previous commanding officer was a jerk. Yeah, it was horrible, and yet he still set the example by being the best follower, and that's another key attribute of a good leader, is that a good leader is a good follower.
Yep.
And he set that example, and those men followed him into battle, risked their lives. You'd mentioned earlier that, leadership isn't a title, right? Because it's a characteristic.
Right.
Leadership is a series of attributes and characteristics. And like we said earlier, you could be running a nursing home ministry and still be an effective leader. You can be, you could be the janitor in a building or a church or ministry and be an effective leader.
Could be a doorkeeper.
Yeah, you'd be a doorkeeper. So there was a book that probably kicked it off for me, 25, 30 years ago, and it was The Effective Executive by Peter F. Drucker. And Drucker is considered like the doctorate in management and leadership stuff. But he kind of set the bar. And the reason why he called it, I thought it was interesting. It's called Effective Executive, and that book was to apply to every person, whether it's the lowest person on the executive rung to the CEO of the business. He says everybody can be an executive, but it's what matters is, are you an effective executive? So he laid out a bunch of characteristics and practices: managing your time, choosing, what to contribute to the organization, knowing where and how to mobilize strength for best effect, setting the right priorities, and then putting that all together with effective decision making. And he said that even the guy at the bottom of the company corporate structure can be an effective executive. So I would want to kind of relay that message to believers. It doesn't matter what you're doing in church, what your role is. It doesn't matter if you're in a ministry or you work at McDonald's as a Bible believer. You know what you ought to do working in McDonald's as a Bible believer? You ought to be the best employee at McDonald's. And the management and the leadership should look to you and say, man, that guy sets the example over and over again. That guy influences his team. That guy sets the right precedent. That guy communicates effectively, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what your level is. So it doesn't matter what your title is. Like you said, it's not about a title. It's about having this mentality. And again, like Paul, he says, you knew my manner of life. You knew how I conduct myself. So that's exactly what a good leader should do.
Yep. Agreed. I tell my colleagues or people that I've been mentoring into a leadership position, I tell them, it's like the moment you lose the trust or respect of the people that you're leading, might as well resign.
Yep.
Or work very, very hard to figure out what you did wrong and failed, and then try to get it back, like David did with his mistake.
That's right.
Take ownership. If you don't take ownership, then you shouldn't be leading anything or anyone.
That's it. King Saul's leadership, it relied on physical intimidation, self-preservation, and it resulted in paralyzed followers who left their king isolated by himself. Nobody cared about him. Nobody wanted to protect him. Nobody wanted to uphold his legacy. But in contrast, King David's leadership, he invested in others. He modeled courage, and it resulted in a fiercely loyal team of mighty men who protected and sustained the kingdom as David grew weaker. This contrast, again, it provides these, eternal, universal leadership principles that you can apply to business, the home, the military, ministry. It doesn't matter what it is. So I just thought it was an interesting case study looking at the contrast between Saul's leadership and David's leadership and what it can teach us about being a manager or leader today.
Yep. Applied in all things. I couldn't help when we've been reading some of the quotes from Patton. There's another really good one. I want to throw one in here just for the heck of it. Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best. It removes all that is base. All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. Duty is the essence of manhood.
That's it.
I love it.
That's why, and I would say this, that when you look at, what Timothy said, he said that we're supposed to be a good soldier, right? A good soldier for Jesus Christ. And he likened us to footmen as the common soldier on the ground. And he says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3, he says, thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. And he says, verse 4, no man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier. That's duty. That means that you can't get entangled with, I mean, it's easy as a Christian at a job to get entangled in the politics of the job, right? It's easy to get wrapped up in the emotional immaturity of some of the leadership you work under. The Bible says you cannot entangle yourself with the affairs of this life, that you need to please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier. So there's another episode I'd like to do. Maybe we could do it as a follow-up next week, is the example that Jesus Christ set. Like, what do you do when you work for a bad manager? So there's a very, very powerful passage in Peter that maybe we can do an expository study on to kind of show that. And I think it's a really convicting passage of scripture for me. And, it's really set me in my place a few times. But anyway, the point today is just wanted to look at the difference in the leadership styles of David and Saul and what it teaches us about being leaders today.
Yep, right on. What we'll do is we'll be sure to add some of the book recommendations in the description when we drop the episode out. So we have Jocko Willink's Extreme Ownership. Also mentioned Band of Brothers is a really good book, and Peter Drucker's book, The Effective Executive, which is an excellent book. I'm going to throw one more in there that I thought was good that you've read as well, which was Dave Ramsey, which was called EntreLeadership. Really, really good book on leadership and management. So highly recommend those 4. We'll put them in the description if you want to check them out. Really good reads or listens. You can get them on Audible and listen in on on your way to work or something like that. So
yep, absolutely.
Be on lookout. But yeah, let's do something like this next week. If anybody has any questions, as usual, drop us a line if you want the notes or anything else like that. We'll be happy to share it with everybody. So until next time, we will see you on the next episode.